Night settles gently over Baltimore, the kind of quiet that feels thick rather than peaceful. Streetlights hum softly, casting long amber reflections across cracked pavement and narrow row-house windows. From the outside, the city appears to be resting, exhaling after another long day. But beneath this calm surface, another Baltimore exists, one shaped by whispered deals, patient calculations, and men who learned long ago that true power rarely announces itself. In the late 1980s, while headlines chased louder criminals and flashier violence, there was a name spoken carefully in courtrooms, police offices, and federal task forces. Melvin Williams. Not shouted. Not glorified. Spoken low, as if volume alone might give him an advantage. By 1987, Baltimore was already wounded. Factories had closed, jobs had vanished, and entire neighborhoods seemed suspended in a permanent dusk of neglect. Addiction moved quietly through these streets, first with heroin, then with cocaine, weaving itself into daily life until it felt unavoidable. To many residents, survival meant adapting to forces beyond their control. To a few, survival meant learning how to control those forces. Melvin Williams was one of those few. He did not rule corners with guns blazing or intimidate rivals with public executions. His authority came from something colder and far more enduring: discipline, intelligence, and an uncanny understanding of how systems functioned, both legal and illegal. Law enforcement struggled with him from the beginning. He did not behave like the men they had studied in training manuals. There were no flashy cars to photograph, no loose talk overheard in bars, no erratic behavior that signaled desperation. Williams moved through Baltimore like a shadow cast by the city itself, present, influential, but difficult to define. Detectives would later admit that the absence of chaos around him was unsettling. Violence attracts attention. Silence invites curiosity. And Melvin Williams thrived in silence. As the years passed, investigators became convinced that he stood at the center of Baltimore's drug economy, orchestrating distribution on a scale that rivaled major metropolitan hubs. Yet every attempt to pin him down dissolved into frustration. Informants came forward and disappeared. Wiretaps captured coded conversations that revealed everything and nothing at the same time. Surveillance teams watched buildings where nothing illegal ever seemed to happen. It was as if Williams understood not just the law, but the psychology of those tasked with enforcing it. By the mid-1980s, the pressure intensified. The federal government does not abandon cases easily, especially when pride becomes involved. Prosecutors invested years assembling what they believed would be an airtight prosecution. They were convinced that no one could operate at that level for so long without leaving fingerprints behind. Somewhere, they believed, the system would finally catch him. What they underestimated was that Melvin Williams had built his life around the assumption that it eventually would. In the background of this quiet war, the city kept breathing. Children walked to school past boarded-up houses. Storefront churches opened their doors to fewer congregants each year. Ambulance sirens echoed more frequently at night. To many residents, Melvin Williams was an invisible figure, known only through rumor and half-finished stories. To others, especially those who worked in the shadows of law enforcement, he became an obsession. A symbol of everything they believed the justice system was failing to contain. What made Williams particularly fascinating was not merely his success, but his restraint. In an era when excess defined many criminal figures, he practiced moderation. He avoided attention the way others chased it. He understood that power, when displayed too openly, invites erosion. This philosophy insulated him for years, allowing his operation to function with the precision of a corporation rather than the volatility of a street gang. It also made him harder to demonize. There were no dramatic sound bites, no theatrical moments for the evening news. Just a man who seemed to understand that longevity mattered more than legend. As 1987 approached, the case against him reached a boiling point. Federal prosecutors prepared to unveil what they believed would finally expose the man behind the myth. The trial promised answers, to investigators who had dedicated careers to bringing him down, and to a public largely unaware of how deeply one individual could shape an entire city's underground economy. Expectations were high. Confidence was higher. Few considered the possibility that the system itself might be outmatched. Inside courtrooms, anticipation hung in the air like static. Outside, Baltimore moved on, unaware that one of the most significant criminal trials in its history was about to unfold. For Melvin Williams, the moment was not dramatic. There were no emotional displays, no outward signs of fear. He had prepared for this day not for months, but for decades. Every choice he had made, every conversation avoided, every risk calculated, had led here. This story is not about gunfights or explosive betrayals. It is about patience. About a man who learned early that chaos consumes those who create it, while order protects those who understand it. It is about a city that unknowingly shaped one of the most elusive figures in American criminal history, and a justice system forced to confront its own limitations. As the trial loomed, one question lingered quietly in the background, unanswered and unsettling. What happens when a man learns the rules so well that he can bend them without breaking them? In the stillness of Baltimore nights, as the city seemed to drift toward sleep, a larger reckoning was approaching. One that would leave investigators stunned, reshape careers, and force an uncomfortable realization, that sometimes, the most dangerous criminals are not the loudest ones, but the ones who wait. Before Melvin Williams ever became a name whispered in federal buildings, Baltimore itself was already changing in ways that felt slow at first, almost unnoticeable. The city had once been defined by industry, by shipyards and steel, by the steady rhythm of men and women clocking in and out of work that promised stability, if not prosperity. For decades, those jobs gave structure to entire neighborhoods. Row houses filled with families who believed that showing up every day was enough to secure a future. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, that rhythm began to falter, then fracture. Factories closed quietly. Ports grew less active. Jobs that once passed from father to son simply vanished, leaving behind empty buildings and unanswered questions. The physical landscape of Baltimore started to mirror this loss. Brick structures that once housed thriving businesses became hollow shells. Paint peeled. Windows stayed boarded. Entire blocks seemed to pause in time, suspended between what they had been and what they might become. For residents, especially in predominantly black neighborhoods, the sense of abandonment was not theoretical. It was daily, visible, and deeply personal. Opportunities narrowed, while expectations remained unchanged. The city felt like it was asking people to survive without giving them the tools to do so. As economic foundations crumbled, another force quietly moved in to fill the vacuum. Heroin had been present before, but now it spread with greater consistency, embedding itself into daily life. At first, it was spoken about in hushed tones, something happening to other people, on other blocks. Over time, it became impossible to ignore. Addiction reshaped routines, strained families, and altered the emotional temperature of entire neighborhoods. Ambulances became a familiar sound at night. Police presence increased, but rarely brought relief. Arrests happened, yet the underlying problems remained untouched. Baltimore's segregation, both historical and ongoing, intensified these effects. Redlining and discriminatory housing policies had long confined black residents to certain areas, limiting mobility and access to resources. When industry collapsed, these neighborhoods absorbed the full impact. Schools struggled. Social services thinned. Trust in institutions eroded. In this environment, legality and illegality often blurred, not because people failed to understand the difference, but because survival demanded flexibility. Informal economies flourished where formal ones had failed. By the mid-1970s, the city was no longer simply declining, it was adapting in ways that felt both desperate and inevitable. Street-level drug markets became more organized, more structured. What had once been chaotic exchanges evolved into systems with rules, territories, and hierarchies. Violence existed, but it was not constant everywhere. In some areas, it was replaced by an uneasy order maintained by those who understood that too much disorder attracted attention. These were the early conditions that allowed certain individuals to rise, not through brute force, but through planning and restraint. Law enforcement faced its own transformation during this period. Police departments were overwhelmed, stretched thin across neighborhoods that seemed to need constant attention. Federal agencies began paying closer attention to cities like Baltimore, recognizing patterns that extended beyond local boundaries. Drugs were no longer a street problem, they were part of a national network. Still, the tools available to combat these networks were often blunt, designed for visible crime rather than quiet organization. This mismatch created space for operators who understood how to remain unseen. Cocaine arrived later, but when it did, it changed the city's trajectory even further. It brought faster money, higher stakes, and a different kind of ambition. Yet before cocaine reshaped Baltimore's streets, heroin had already laid the groundwork. It taught lessons about supply chains, distribution, and demand. It revealed how addiction could be both a tragedy and a business. Those who observed carefully learned that the real power did not come from selling drugs directly, but from controlling the flow behind the scenes. For many young men growing up during this era, the future felt abstract. Traditional paths seemed blocked or unreliable. Crime, for some, was not an act of rebellion but an alternative form of employment. Yet even within this world, most did not succeed for long. Impulsiveness, ego, and violence shortened careers quickly. The streets rewarded patience far less often than they punished recklessness. It was within this harsh reality that a different type of figure began to emerge, someone who studied patterns rather than chased thrills. Baltimore's geography played a role as well. Its proximity to major East Coast cities made it an ideal hub for movement, both legal and illegal. Routes that carried goods also carried drugs. Ports that once symbolized commerce now offered concealment. The city became a quiet connector, less visible than New York, less scrutinized than Washington, yet deeply embedded in the flow between them. For someone capable of seeing the city not as broken, but as strategically positioned, Baltimore offered opportunity disguised as decay. Community responses varied. Churches, activists, and neighborhood leaders worked tirelessly to hold things together, often with limited support. Their efforts created pockets of resistance against the tide of addiction and crime. But they were fighting an uphill battle against structural forces that had been building for decades. The result was a city divided not just by race or class, but by hope. Some still believed in reform and recovery. Others accepted that the system had moved on without them. By the early 1980s, Baltimore had developed a reputation that extended beyond its borders. It was seen as troubled, dangerous, and declining. Yet within that reputation existed nuance. There were systems operating smoothly beneath the chaos, networks functioning with remarkable efficiency. These systems did not announce themselves. They did not need to. They relied on predictability, on understanding human behavior, and on exploiting gaps left by institutional neglect. This was the Baltimore that shaped Melvin Williams, not as a singular anomaly, but as a product of environment meeting intellect. The city did not create him alone, but it taught lessons that could not be learned elsewhere. It demonstrated what happens when official systems fail and unofficial ones take their place. It showed how power could be exercised quietly, without spectacle, and how survival could depend on understanding rules that were never written down. As the city drifted deeper into the 1980s, the storm was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. Yet its presence was uneven, felt differently on each block, in each home. Some residents felt only the exhaustion of years without progress. Others sensed opportunity hidden within collapse. Baltimore, weary and watchful, stood as both warning and invitation. And within its dimly lit streets, individuals like Melvin Williams were learning not just how to survive the storm, but how to move calmly at its center. Long before Melvin Williams became associated with whispered rumors and carefully built indictments, he was simply a young man growing up in a city that demanded awareness from an early age. Baltimore did not offer many illusions, especially to those who paid attention. The streets taught lessons quickly, and not all of them were cruel. Some were practical, rooted in observation rather than fear. Williams was known even in his youth as someone who watched more than he spoke, who absorbed details others ignored. In classrooms, he demonstrated an intelligence that stood out, not because it was flashy, but because it was consistent. Teachers noticed his focus, his ability to understand systems, patterns, and consequences. For a time, it appeared that his path might lead somewhere far from the streets that would later define his reputation. Education, however, existed within limits imposed by the world outside the classroom. For a young black man in mid-20th century Baltimore, academic promise did not automatically translate into opportunity. The doors that education was supposed to open often remained locked, or at least heavily guarded. Williams learned early that intelligence alone was not enough. It needed direction, strategy, and, above all, patience. This realization did not embitter him. Instead, it sharpened his awareness of how the world truly operated versus how it claimed to. At home and in his neighborhood, he saw adults working hard yet falling behind. Men who had followed the rules still struggled to maintain stability. This disconnect between effort and reward left a lasting impression. It suggested that success was not always a function of morality or diligence, but of positioning. Where you stood in the structure mattered as much as how hard you worked. This understanding quietly shaped his thinking, laying the groundwork for decisions he would make years later. As he moved through adolescence, the contrast between potential and reality grew more pronounced. Friends took different paths, some clinging to legitimate work, others drifting toward the informal economy that had become increasingly visible. Williams observed without rushing to join either. He studied outcomes. He noticed who stayed free, who drew attention, who disappeared into the system. Violence, he saw, was rarely productive in the long term. It created instability and attracted consequences. Those who survived longest were often the ones who remained calm, measured, and selective. When Williams first became involved in illegal activity, it was not driven by recklessness or desperation. It was calculated. He did not leap headfirst into the most visible or dangerous roles. Instead, he positioned himself on the periphery, learning how transactions worked, how trust was established, and how easily it could be broken. He understood that the criminal world, much like the legitimate one, operated on relationships and reputation. But unlike legitimate industries, mistakes were punished swiftly and without appeal. What set him apart during these early years was his refusal to embrace the mythology of the streets. He did not romanticize crime or see it as an expression of identity. To him, it was a function, a means to navigate an environment that offered few alternatives. This detachment allowed him to think clearly when others were clouded by emotion or ego. It also made him difficult to read. People expected ambition to announce itself. Williams let his remain quiet. His early ventures were small, almost unremarkable. He avoided drawing attention, blending into routines that seemed ordinary on the surface. Yet beneath that ordinariness was a growing understanding of how much information people revealed without realizing it. Who talked too much? Who cut corners? Who could be trusted under pressure? Williams cataloged these observations patiently, building a mental map of human behavior that would later prove invaluable. Encounters with law enforcement during this period were minimal, and when they occurred, they reinforced his cautious approach. He saw how easily minor missteps could escalate into life-altering consequences. Arrests were not just punishments, they were disruptions that broke momentum and exposed vulnerabilities. Williams internalized this lesson deeply. Avoiding contact with the system became a priority, not out of fear, but out of strategic clarity. The less the system knew about you, the less power it had over you. At the same time, he continued to refine his understanding of structure. Illegal markets, he realized, mirrored legal ones more than people liked to admit. Supply and demand dictated behavior. Reliability mattered. So did discretion. Those who treated the work like a business, rather than an adventure, tended to last longer. Williams gravitated toward this mindset naturally, applying the same analytical skills that had once served him in school. There was also a growing awareness of time. Many of his peers chased immediate rewards, spending money as quickly as they earned it. Williams thought in longer arcs. He delayed gratification, reinvested resources, and planned several moves ahead. This approach isolated him in some ways. He was not the most popular, nor the most feared. But he was respected by those who understood what he was building, even if they did not fully grasp its scope. Family and community ties remained important during this phase. Williams did not sever himself from the world he came from. Instead, he navigated it carefully, maintaining a sense of normalcy that served as both anchor and cover. He understood that blending in required genuine connection, not performance. This authenticity made him less conspicuous and more trusted, both in legitimate and illegitimate circles. As his involvement deepened, the risks increased, but so did his confidence in his approach. Each successful transaction reinforced his belief that control, not aggression, was the key to longevity. He watched others rise quickly and fall just as fast, often undone by their own need for recognition. Williams took these collapses as cautionary tales. He did not celebrate them. He studied them. By the time he began to step into more significant roles, his foundation was already solid. He had learned how to move through the city without leaving traces, how to communicate without exposing intent, and how to assess people with remarkable accuracy. These were not skills taught openly. They were acquired through observation, restraint, and an unwavering commitment to staying ahead of consequences. This period of his life did not produce headlines or dramatic stories. It was quiet by design. Yet it was during these years that Melvin Williams truly formed, not as a kingpin, but as a strategist. The streets did not shape him through chaos, but through repetition and pattern. He learned how systems failed, how people compensated for those failures, and how someone with patience could position himself at the center without ever stepping into the spotlight. The rise that would follow was not sudden. It was inevitable, built slowly on the lessons learned during these early, watchful years. In the years when Melvin Williams was still forming his understanding of the world, Baltimore functioned like an unspoken classroom. Lessons were not written down, but they were everywhere for those who paid attention. Streets taught cause and effect with brutal honesty. Neighborhoods revealed how power shifted quietly, how influence often mattered more than force. From an early age, Williams showed a rare ability to absorb these lessons without being consumed by them. He did not mistake observation for participation. He watched first, learned second, and acted only when he felt prepared. As a young man, he stood out not because he demanded attention, but because he rarely needed it. He carried himself with composure, speaking only when necessary. This restraint often led people to underestimate him, a mistake that would later repeat itself on a much larger scale. Teachers and peers alike noticed that his mind worked differently. He understood structure intuitively, grasping how individual actions fit into larger systems. In school, this translated into solid academic performance. Outside of school, it translated into an early awareness of how fragile opportunity could be. The reality of Baltimore in those years meant that even the most promising students faced narrowing options. Segregation, limited access to higher education, and shrinking employment prospects created an atmosphere where talent alone could not guarantee advancement. Williams observed how often effort went unrewarded. Men who followed the rules still struggled. Families who did everything right still fell behind. These observations did not push him toward anger or rebellion. Instead, they sharpened his sense of realism. He began to understand that the system rewarded those who knew how to position themselves within it, not just those who worked hardest. In his neighborhood, the contrast between potential and outcome was visible every day. Young men with intelligence and ambition drifted into street economies not out of recklessness, but because those economies offered something the legitimate world increasingly did not, a sense of control. Williams noticed this, but he did not rush to follow. He studied who survived and who did not. He paid attention to patterns. Those who acted impulsively burned out quickly. Those who sought attention attracted consequences. Longevity, he learned, belonged to those who kept their movements small and their intentions private. When Williams eventually took his first steps into criminal activity, it was not a dramatic entry. There was no sudden transformation, no defining moment that marked a clear break from his previous life. Instead, it was a gradual shift, guided by calculation rather than emotion. He chose roles that kept him distant from visibility, allowing him to observe how transactions unfolded without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. This approach frustrated some, who equated courage with boldness. Williams saw courage differently. To him, restraint was strength. He quickly recognized that illegal markets were governed by rules just as rigid as those in legitimate industries. Reliability mattered. Consistency mattered. Reputation mattered most of all. But unlike lawful careers, there were no second chances for serious mistakes. One misjudgment could unravel everything. This reality reinforced his natural caution. He avoided situations where chaos was likely, preferring environments where expectations were clear and variables were limited. During this period, Williams refined his ability to read people. He noticed who spoke too freely, who exaggerated their importance, who became careless under pressure. He learned that the loudest voices were often the least reliable. Trust, he understood, was not built through charisma, but through predictability. He cultivated a presence that was steady and unremarkable, allowing others to feel comfortable around him while revealing more than they intended. Information flowed toward him effortlessly, not because he demanded it, but because he listened. Encounters with law enforcement, though rare, left a lasting impression. Williams observed how quickly small infractions escalated once the system took notice. He saw how arrests disrupted lives, even when they did not lead to convictions. The process itself was punishing. Time was lost. Focus was broken. Momentum disappeared. From this, he drew a critical conclusion: avoiding attention was not merely preferable, it was essential. Staying beneath the surface became a guiding principle. At the same time, he remained grounded in his community. He did not isolate himself or retreat into secrecy. He maintained relationships, routines, and a sense of normalcy that made him difficult to categorize. This balance served him well. He understood that blending in required authenticity. Pretending to be something you were not created inconsistencies, and inconsistencies attracted scrutiny. By remaining connected to his environment, he gained insight without standing out. Money, when it began to come, was treated as a tool rather than a trophy. Williams resisted the urge to display success. He had watched others make that mistake and pay for it. Instead of spending recklessly, he reinvested, planning for stability rather than spectacle. This long-term thinking separated him from many of his peers. While others chased immediate gratification, Williams focused on sustainability. He thought in years, not weeks. As his confidence grew, so did his awareness of risk. He understood that advancement required exposure, but he carefully measured how much he was willing to accept. Each step forward was calculated, weighed against potential consequences. This methodical progression frustrated those who favored speed, but it protected him. He was building something slowly, intentionally, without the cracks that rushed success often created. Throughout these formative years, Williams never lost sight of the broader picture. He did not view his actions as isolated events, but as part of an interconnected system shaped by economics, policy, and human behavior. This perspective allowed him to adapt as conditions changed. When opportunities shifted, he shifted with them. When danger increased, he adjusted his position. Flexibility became one of his defining strengths. What makes this period of his life so significant is not what happened, but how it happened. There were no dramatic confrontations, no defining arrests, no moments that demanded attention. It was a quiet accumulation of knowledge, experience, and discipline. Each observation added another layer to his understanding of how power functioned. Each decision reinforced his commitment to remaining invisible. By the time Melvin Williams began to assume more central roles within Baltimore's underground economy, he was already prepared. He had learned how to move through systems without triggering alarms, how to influence outcomes without appearing involved, and how to maintain control without resorting to fear. These skills were not accidental. They were forged during years of careful observation and deliberate restraint. This early phase of his life reveals a truth often overlooked in stories about crime and power. The most influential figures are rarely those who announce themselves. They are the ones who listen, learn, and wait. Williams' rise did not begin with ambition alone, but with understanding. And it was this understanding, cultivated quietly during his formative years, that would later allow him to operate at levels few could reach, and even fewer could fully comprehend. By the time Melvin Williams began moving more deliberately within Baltimore's underground economy, he had already learned one essential truth: not all movement was progress, and not all risk was worth taking. The city offered countless examples of men who mistook speed for success. They rushed, they boasted, they drew attention, and in doing so, they shortened their own futures. Williams chose a different path. His entry into deeper criminal involvement was not a leap, but a careful step, measured and deliberate, guided by the same patience that had shaped his earlier years. At first, his role remained understated. He positioned himself close enough to learn, yet far enough to remain unexposed. This distance allowed him to observe how deals were made, how trust was negotiated, and how easily it could collapse. He noticed that many failures had less to do with law enforcement and more to do with human error. Greed led to shortcuts. Ego led to unnecessary conflicts. Fear led to mistakes. Williams internalized these patterns, storing them away like reference material for future decisions. What separated him from many others was his ability to treat criminal activity as a system rather than an identity. He did not see himself as a street figure or a symbol of rebellion. He saw an economy shaped by demand, supply, and opportunity. This perspective allowed him to detach emotionally from individual transactions. When things went wrong, he did not react impulsively. He analyzed what had happened, adjusted his approach, and moved forward without drama. As his confidence grew, so did his network. Relationships formed slowly, based on reliability rather than charisma. Williams understood that in environments defined by risk, consistency was more valuable than charm. He followed through on commitments, communicated clearly, and avoided unnecessary complications. Over time, this earned him a reputation for professionalism. People trusted him not because he inspired fear, but because he reduced uncertainty. Law enforcement presence during this period was constant but uneven. Police patrols ebbed and flowed, responding to visible crime while often overlooking quieter operations. Williams recognized this imbalance and structured his activities accordingly. He avoided high-traffic areas and unpredictable associates. He favored routines over spontaneity, understanding that predictability could be a shield if managed correctly. The goal was not to disappear completely, but to blend seamlessly into the background. He also paid close attention to the flow of information. Gossip, he realized, was as dangerous as any weapon. Loose talk created narratives that could be traced, misunderstood, or exploited. Williams spoke little and listened carefully. When he did communicate, it was purposeful and restrained. This habit not only protected him, but also encouraged others to reveal more than they intended. Silence, he discovered, often invited disclosure. As he took on greater responsibility, the stakes increased. Larger transactions meant greater exposure, and with exposure came vulnerability. Williams responded by tightening control rather than expanding recklessly. He compartmentalized operations, limiting how much any one person knew. This structure mirrored legitimate corporate models, where information was distributed on a need-to-know basis. The effect was twofold: it reduced risk and reinforced his position at the center. Violence, while present in the broader environment, was something he actively avoided. Not out of moral hesitation, but out of strategic clarity. Violence disrupted stability and drew attention from both law enforcement and rivals. Williams understood that fear was a blunt instrument. It produced obedience in the short term but bred resentment and retaliation over time. He preferred cooperation rooted in mutual benefit, a quieter form of control that proved far more durable. Money management further distinguished him from others. Where many spent quickly to signal success, Williams treated profit as a resource to be preserved and leveraged. He reinvested carefully, building layers of insulation between himself and the most visible aspects of the trade. This approach not only increased sustainability but also provided flexibility. When conditions changed, he could adapt without panic. Throughout this phase, Williams maintained a disciplined personal life. He avoided habits that clouded judgment or created vulnerability. Excess, he believed, was a liability. This discipline extended to his surroundings as well. He chose locations, times, and associates with intention, minimizing exposure to unpredictable variables. Every detail mattered, from who was present to how conversations unfolded. Encounters with law enforcement became more frequent, though still indirect. Surveillance intensified in certain neighborhoods. Arrests rippled through networks, sending warnings to those paying attention. Williams watched these developments closely, adjusting his strategies in response. He treated law enforcement as a constant factor rather than an adversary to be challenged. Understanding their methods allowed him to anticipate pressure points and avoid them. Trust remained a central concern. As his influence expanded, so did the risk of betrayal. Williams approached this reality with caution rather than paranoia. He tested relationships over time, observing how individuals behaved under stress. He believed that true loyalty revealed itself not through words, but through consistency. This patience often paid off, allowing him to build a core network that valued stability over quick gains. What emerged during these years was a distinctive style of leadership. Williams did not command through intimidation or spectacle. He influenced through reliability, discretion, and foresight. Those who worked with him felt protected from chaos, shielded by his careful planning. This sense of security fostered loyalty, creating a self-reinforcing system that further reduced his need to assert authority overtly. As his role solidified, so did his understanding of scale. He recognized that growth for its own sake was dangerous. Expansion had to be justified, controlled, and supported by infrastructure. Without this foundation, success became fragile. Williams resisted pressure to move faster, even when opportunities seemed abundant. He trusted his instincts, shaped by years of observation, over the urgency of the moment. By the time his operations reached a level that would later draw serious federal attention, the groundwork had already been laid. What appeared to outsiders as a sudden rise was, in reality, the result of years of quiet preparation. Every decision, every restraint, every moment of patience contributed to a structure designed to endure. This phase of Melvin Williams' life reveals the mechanics of his ascent. It was not fueled by bravado or violence, but by discipline and understanding. He learned the rules of the game by watching others break them. He advanced not by forcing outcomes, but by positioning himself where outcomes flowed naturally in his favor. And as he moved deeper into Baltimore's underground, he did so without noise, leaving behind few traces, and building a presence that would later confound those tasked with bringing him down. As Baltimore moved deeper into the 1970s, the city's relationship with heroin hardened into something grimly familiar. What had once felt like an intrusion now felt permanent, woven into the daily rhythm of certain neighborhoods. For Melvin Williams, this period marked a turning point. He was no longer simply learning the mechanics of the underground economy, he was beginning to shape it. The heroin trade, with its steady demand and predictable patterns, offered an environment where discipline and structure could outperform chaos. Williams understood this instinctively, and he positioned himself accordingly. Unlike many who entered the trade seeking quick wealth, Williams approached heroin distribution with the mindset of a long-term operator. He recognized that addiction created consistency. Demand did not fluctuate wildly, it persisted quietly, relentlessly. This stability allowed for planning, and planning allowed for control. He focused not on street-level transactions, but on the systems that fed them. Supply chains, storage, transportation, and payment methods became his primary concerns. By distancing himself from direct sales, he reduced exposure while increasing influence. Williams' operation grew not through conquest, but through alignment. He preferred partnerships to takeovers, understanding that cooperation reduced conflict and preserved order. Rather than absorbing territory through force, he found ways to integrate existing networks under a shared structure. This approach minimized disruption and drew less attention. It also created a sense of continuity that benefited everyone involved, except those trying to dismantle it from the outside. One of his greatest strengths during this era was his ability to anticipate pressure. Law enforcement attention ebbed and flowed, often reacting to visible spikes in violence or overdoses. Williams structured his operation to remain beneath these thresholds. He avoided sudden expansions that might attract scrutiny. Growth was incremental, almost invisible. To outsiders, the heroin problem seemed unchanged, but behind the scenes, control was consolidating. Communication within his network was tightly managed. Williams avoided direct involvement in conversations that could be intercepted or misunderstood. Messages passed through trusted intermediaries, often using language that revealed nothing to anyone not already informed. This layered approach insulated him from exposure and created plausible deniability. Even when authorities suspected his involvement, proving it became another matter entirely. Violence, when it occurred, was treated as a failure rather than a tool. Williams believed that every act of violence created ripples, emotional, social, and legal, that were impossible to fully control. He discouraged it whenever possible, preferring negotiation or disengagement. This philosophy not only reduced attention from law enforcement but also stabilized relationships within the network. People felt safer operating under his influence, knowing that impulsive actions were discouraged. The money flowing through the heroin trade was substantial, but Williams treated it with caution. He understood that sudden wealth could be as dangerous as sudden violence. Large purchases and extravagant displays created questions. Instead, he focused on financial discipline. Profits were moved carefully, often reinvested or concealed in ways that avoided obvious trails. This restraint further contributed to his invisibility. During this time, his reputation solidified. Within the underground, he was known as someone who handled business cleanly. Disputes were resolved quietly. Agreements were honored. Mistakes were addressed without drama. This consistency attracted others seeking stability in an otherwise volatile environment. Over time, his influence extended across large portions of Baltimore's heroin distribution network, though his name rarely surfaced publicly. Law enforcement agencies began to sense that something more organized was at work. Arrests at the street level did little to disrupt supply. New dealers appeared almost immediately, operating with the same efficiency as those who had been removed. This resilience puzzled investigators. It suggested a centralized structure capable of absorbing losses without collapsing. Suspicion gradually coalesced around Williams, though evidence remained elusive. Williams responded to this increased attention not with fear, but with refinement. He tightened protocols, reduced exposure, and further compartmentalized operations. The more pressure he sensed, the quieter his presence became. This adaptability frustrated authorities, who found themselves chasing shadows rather than targets. Every step they took seemed to confirm his existence without bringing them closer to proof. At the community level, the heroin trade left visible scars. Addiction devastated families and neighborhoods, creating cycles of loss that felt endless. Williams was aware of this reality, though he rarely discussed it openly. His focus remained on survival and control, shaped by an environment that offered few ethical absolutes. This tension, between the harm caused and the order maintained, would later complicate how his legacy was understood. As the decade progressed, Williams' operation reached a level of sophistication that rivaled legitimate enterprises. Roles were clearly defined. Responsibilities were limited. Information flowed upward while exposure flowed downward. This structure protected those at the top while allowing the system to function smoothly. It also meant that when disruptions occurred, they could be isolated and managed without unraveling the whole. The heroin years were, in many ways, the foundation of everything that followed. They provided Williams with the resources, experience, and confidence needed to navigate even greater challenges. They also taught him the limits of invisibility. No matter how carefully an operation was run, success eventually attracted attention. The key, he believed, was not to avoid this attention entirely, but to survive it. As Baltimore moved toward the 1980s, new substances and new dynamics began to emerge. Cocaine loomed on the horizon, promising faster profits and greater risks. Williams watched these developments closely, aware that change was coming. Yet he did not rush to adapt. He had learned that timing mattered as much as opportunity. For now, the heroin trade remained steady, predictable, and under control. In the quiet hours of the city, as deals were made without words and networks functioned without fanfare, Melvin Williams stood at the center of an invisible empire. It was built not on fear or spectacle, but on patience and precision. And though few could see it clearly, its influence was undeniable, shaping the city's underground economy in ways that would echo long after the decade came to an end. Section 6 KO expand Caro 1100 plus word without any headings and numbers. By the time Melvin Williams had secured his position within Baltimore's heroin economy, his approach to power had become unmistakably clear. He did not dominate through noise or intimidation. Instead, he practiced a philosophy of control that relied on restraint, predictability, and an almost clinical understanding of human behavior. While others equated authority with fear, Williams understood that fear was unstable. It demanded constant reinforcement and inevitably produced resistance. Control, as he defined it, was quieter and far more durable. Those who worked within his orbit often remarked on how unremarkable his presence felt. There were no grand entrances, no displays meant to impress or threaten. He dressed plainly, moved casually, and avoided anything that might draw a second look. This ordinariness was deliberate. Williams believed that blending in was a form of protection. The more ordinary he appeared, the less reason anyone had to scrutinize him. In a world where attention could be fatal, anonymity was a shield. Communication was one of his most carefully managed tools. Williams spoke deliberately, choosing words with precision. He avoided giving direct orders whenever possible, preferring suggestions framed as mutual benefit. This approach fostered cooperation rather than obedience. People felt involved rather than controlled, which reduced resentment and increased loyalty. When problems arose, they were addressed privately, without spectacle. Mistakes were corrected quietly, preserving dignity and stability within the network. Trust, in his view, was not an emotional bond but a functional one. He did not expect loyalty based on friendship or shared history. He expected consistency. Individuals who performed reliably earned greater responsibility over time. Those who proved unpredictable were gradually distanced, not punished. This slow, almost invisible pruning kept his organization lean and reduced the risk of dramatic betrayals. By the time someone realized they had been excluded, the damage had already been minimized. Williams also understood the importance of boundaries. He maintained clear separations between different aspects of his operation, ensuring that no single person possessed enough information to compromise the whole. This compartmentalization mirrored intelligence and corporate structures, reflecting his appreciation for systems designed to withstand pressure. If one segment faltered, the others continued functioning. This resilience frustrated law enforcement, who found it difficult to identify a single point of failure. Violence, when unavoidable, was treated as an anomaly rather than a tactic. Williams recognized that every act of violence carried unpredictable consequences. It attracted attention, destabilized relationships, and escalated conflicts. He preferred resolution through negotiation or disengagement, even if it meant sacrificing short-term gains. This restraint earned him a reputation for fairness within the underground, a rare quality in an environment often defined by volatility. His control extended beyond logistics into psychology. Williams paid close attention to how people responded to stress, success, and disappointment. He understood that most mistakes occurred when emotions overrode judgment. By keeping operations calm and predictable, he reduced the likelihood of emotional reactions. This environment allowed individuals to perform consistently, further reinforcing stability. In many ways, his organization functioned as a refuge from the chaos that characterized much of the street-level trade. Money, too, was managed with discipline. Williams avoided ostentatious spending, understanding that wealth displayed was wealth questioned. He lived comfortably but not extravagantly, maintaining a lifestyle that raised few suspicions. This restraint protected him legally and socially. It also reinforced his image as someone grounded and reliable, rather than reckless or greedy. Financial control became another layer of insulation between him and scrutiny. As his influence grew, so did his awareness of perception. Williams understood that reputation operated on two levels: what people believed and what they could prove. He cultivated a reputation for professionalism without allowing concrete evidence to accumulate. Stories circulated, but stories alone were not enough to sustain prosecutions. This ambiguity worked in his favor, creating an aura of influence that deterred rivals while remaining legally intangible. Law enforcement agencies, observing from the outside, struggled to reconcile his calm demeanor with the scale of activity they suspected. He did not fit their profile of a kingpin. There were no outbursts, no public feuds, no visible signs of excess. This mismatch led to miscalculations, underestimations, and prolonged investigations. Williams benefited from these delays, using time as another tool of control. Internally, he encouraged patience and foresight. Quick profits were discouraged if they introduced unnecessary risk. Expansion was measured and justified. Every decision was evaluated for its long-term impact. This conservative approach limited growth but increased sustainability. Williams understood that in his world, survival was the ultimate success. Everything else was secondary. He also remained adaptable. Control, he believed, required flexibility. When conditions changed, whether due to law enforcement pressure, market shifts, or internal dynamics, he adjusted without resistance. Rigidity, he knew, was dangerous. This willingness to evolve allowed his operation to remain effective even as external circumstances shifted. Community perception mattered as well. Williams avoided unnecessary disruption in the neighborhoods where his influence was strongest. While he could not erase the harm caused by addiction, he sought to minimize collateral damage. Excessive violence or chaos would draw attention and destabilize the environment he relied on. Maintaining a degree of order served both practical and reputational purposes. Over time, this philosophy of control created an organization that functioned smoothly and quietly. Those within it understood expectations and operated with a sense of security uncommon in illicit markets. This stability reduced turnover and increased efficiency. It also reinforced Williams' position as the central figure, the one whose presence ensured balance. This period reveals the essence of Melvin Williams' power. It was not rooted in intimidation or spectacle, but in understanding. He mastered the art of influence by mastering himself, his impulses, his desires, his need for recognition. In doing so, he built a system that reflected his values: calm, calculated, and enduring. As Baltimore continued to evolve and new challenges loomed, this philosophy would be tested. But during these years, it served him well, allowing him to operate at a level few could reach and even fewer could disrupt. His control was not loud, but it was absolute in its quiet way, shaping the city's underground with a steadiness that felt almost invisible. Melvin Williams' influence deepened and his systems grew more refined. It was inevitable that attention would begin to gather around him, slowly at first, then with increasing focus. Law enforcement did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It crept in through routine reports, fragmented intelligence, and patterns that refused to disappear. Street-level arrests continued, yet the supply never truly dried up. New faces replaced old ones with unsettling efficiency. For investigators paying close attention, this consistency suggested organization, something stable beneath the surface chaos. At first, Williams existed more as a theory than a target. Detectives spoke his name cautiously, often prefaced with uncertainty. They sensed his presence without being able to define it. There were no photographs plastered on corkboards, no dramatic surveillance footage, no clear evidence that could anchor an investigation. Instead, there were whispers from informants, fragments of conversations overheard and then lost, and a persistent sense that someone unseen was coordinating the flow. This ambiguity frustrated law enforcement. Their training emphasized visible hierarchies and identifiable leaders. Williams offered neither. He did not frequent known hotspots. He did not appear at crime scenes. He did not associate openly with individuals already under scrutiny. His movements blended seamlessly into the city's daily rhythms. To an untrained eye, he was just another resident navigating Baltimore's streets. As suspicion grew, so did the pressure to produce results. Investigators began expanding their methods, relying more heavily on informants and surveillance. Wiretaps were authorized, though rarely yielded usable evidence. Conversations were coded, layered with meaning that evaporated under scrutiny. What seemed incriminating one moment became innocuous the next. Williams' discipline in communication paid dividends here. He understood that words could betray more than actions, and he limited both carefully. Informants posed a particular challenge. Some claimed intimate knowledge of Williams' operation, yet their stories often conflicted or lacked corroboration. Others exaggerated their proximity in hopes of leniency or reward. Williams anticipated this vulnerability and structured his network to minimize the damage any single informant could cause. No one knew enough to tell the whole story. Even those who believed they did were often missing critical pieces. Surveillance teams watched buildings, tracked movements, and documented routines. What they found was frustratingly ordinary. There were no dramatic exchanges, no late-night convoys, no visible signs of wealth or power. Williams' lifestyle offered few clues. He lived comfortably but modestly, avoiding the trappings that often betrayed criminal success. This restraint created doubt among investigators, who struggled to reconcile their suspicions with the evidence, or lack thereof, before them. Despite these challenges, pressure continued to mount. Federal agencies began to take an interest, drawn by the persistence of Baltimore's drug problem and the apparent resilience of its supply networks. Task forces were assembled, pooling resources and expertise. The focus shifted from individual arrests to broader patterns. Investigators began mapping relationships, tracing financial flows, and looking for inconsistencies that might reveal hidden structures. Williams, for his part, sensed the shift. He did not need confirmation to recognize increased attention. Subtle changes, longer pauses in familiar routines, new faces lingering too long, questions that felt rehearsed, signaled heightened scrutiny. He responded not with panic, but with refinement. Operations became even more compartmentalized. Communication channels narrowed. Exposure was reduced wherever possible. This period tested his philosophy of control. Avoiding attention required constant vigilance. One careless associate, one misinterpreted conversation, could unravel years of careful planning. Williams doubled down on discipline, reinforcing expectations without drawing attention to the reason. Those unable to adapt were quietly removed from sensitive roles. The system adjusted, tightening like a muscle under strain. Law enforcement efforts intensified, yet progress remained elusive. Investigators found themselves chasing shadows, piecing together fragments that never quite aligned. Each lead seemed promising until it wasn't. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny. This cycle bred frustration, but also determination. The belief that Williams was central to Baltimore's drug trade hardened into conviction, even as proof remained out of reach. Courtrooms became stages for this tension. Prosecutors tested cases built on circumstantial evidence, often watching them falter. Judges demanded clarity and corroboration. Defense attorneys dismantled narratives that relied too heavily on assumption. Williams, when he appeared at all, did so without drama. He maintained composure, offering nothing that could be seized upon. His demeanor reinforced the ambiguity that protected him. Behind the scenes, the psychological toll on investigators grew. Years invested without tangible results challenged confidence and morale. Some began to question whether Williams was as influential as suspected. Others believed his very elusiveness confirmed his importance. This division slowed momentum, allowing Williams more time to adapt and endure. Time, he understood, was an ally. The longer investigations dragged on, the more resources they consumed. Attention shifted, priorities changed, personnel rotated. Williams relied on this inevitability, trusting that patience would outlast urgency. He did not seek confrontation or resolution. He sought continuation. At the community level, the impact of law enforcement pressure was uneven. Increased police presence disrupted daily life, heightening tension and mistrust. Williams avoided being drawn into these dynamics, maintaining distance from visible conflict. His goal remained stability, even as the environment grew more volatile. As the years progressed, the quiet contest between Williams and the system deepened. Neither side claimed victory. Law enforcement refined its methods, learning from setbacks. Williams refined his defenses, anticipating adjustments. It was a slow dance, measured and deliberate, played out over years rather than moments. This phase of his life underscores the paradox at the heart of his story. The more attention he attracted, the less visible he became. Efforts to expose him only highlighted the sophistication of his approach. He had built not just an operation, but a method of existing within scrutiny without being consumed by it. As federal interests solidified and investigations matured, the stakes increased. The system was preparing for something larger, something definitive. Williams sensed this, though he could not know when or how it would arrive. What he did know was that the quiet war was far from over. The shadows were closing in, but he had spent a lifetime learning how to move within them. By the early 1980s, a new current began moving through Baltimore's underground, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Cocaine arrived not as a replacement for heroin, but as an evolution of the market itself. It carried a different energy, a different promise. Faster profits, broader appeal, and a sense of modernity that contrasted sharply with heroin's grim familiarity. For Melvin Williams, this shift represented both opportunity and danger. He had built his power on stability. Cocaine threatened to disrupt that balance. Unlike heroin, which had settled into predictable patterns, cocaine attracted a wider demographic and encouraged rapid expansion. Money moved faster. Ambitions grew larger. Violence often followed. Williams watched these developments carefully, aware that many established operators were being tempted into reckless growth. He resisted the urge to rush in. Experience had taught him that early adoption carried risks as well as rewards. He preferred to observe first, understanding the terrain before committing resources. As cocaine distribution expanded, so did law enforcement focus. The drug's visibility and association with rising crime rates made it a political priority. Task forces multiplied. Sentencing guidelines hardened. Media attention intensified. Williams recognized that cocaine would be policed differently, more aggressively, than heroin had been. This required adaptation, not just in logistics, but in philosophy. When he did begin to integrate cocaine into his operation, he did so selectively. He avoided the most volatile segments of the trade, favoring controlled distribution channels that mirrored his heroin model. Again, distance was key. Williams insulated himself from direct contact, relying on trusted intermediaries and compartmentalized structures. The goal was to benefit from the market without becoming consumed by it. Cocaine also brought new personalities into the underground. Younger, more aggressive operators sought rapid dominance, often displaying wealth openly and engaging in public disputes. Williams viewed this behavior as self-defeating. He understood that attention was a currency he could not afford to spend. As others competed loudly for territory and reputation, he continued to operate quietly, allowing the chaos to draw scrutiny away from his own activities. The economics of cocaine differed in ways that required careful management. Profit margins were higher, but so were losses when things went wrong. Supply chains were longer and more exposed. Prices fluctuated more dramatically. Williams applied the same analytical approach that had served him well before, studying these variables and adjusting his involvement accordingly. He did not chase volume for its own sake. He prioritized consistency and control. This period also tested his relationships. Some associates pushed for faster expansion, eager to capitalize on cocaine's momentum. Williams resisted these pressures, sometimes at the cost of short-term alliances. He believed that compromise in this area would erode the stability he had worked years to establish. Those unwilling to accept his pace were allowed to drift away, replaced by individuals aligned with his cautious philosophy. Law enforcement, meanwhile, intensified efforts to map cocaine networks. Surveillance increased. Informant recruitment accelerated. The environment grew more volatile, with arrests and seizures making headlines. Williams adapted by further reducing his visible footprint. He refined communication protocols, limited meetings, and avoided patterns that could be exploited. Each adjustment was subtle, but collectively they strengthened his defenses. Despite these precautions, the cocaine era brought unavoidable risks. The drug's popularity increased the likelihood of unpredictable interactions, both within and outside established networks. Williams responded by reinforcing boundaries and expectations. Violence was discouraged even more strongly than before. Disputes were mediated quickly and quietly. Stability remained the guiding principle. Community impact during this time became more pronounced. Cocaine spread exacerbated existing social fractures, accelerating cycles of addiction and crime. Williams was aware of these consequences, though his role in addressing them was limited. His focus remained on maintaining control within a shifting landscape, a task that grew more complex with each passing year. The contrast between his approach and that of others became increasingly stark. While rivals burned brightly and briefly, attracting attention and retaliation, Williams endured. His operations adjusted to the new market without losing their underlying structure. This resilience reinforced his reputation among those who valued longevity over spectacle. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that the cocaine shift had reshaped Baltimore's underground. Many who had rushed and were gone, their ambitions cut short by violence or incarceration. Williams remained, having navigated the transition without dramatic disruption. This survival was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate restraint and careful timing. Yet survival did not mean invisibility. The scale of his operation, now spanning multiple substances, inevitably attracted greater scrutiny. Federal agencies, already watching him, intensified their focus. The pieces of a larger case were slowly coming together, even if the picture remained incomplete. Williams sensed the tightening net, though its contours were still unclear. As the decade progressed, the cocaine era tested every aspect of his philosophy. It demanded adaptation without surrender, growth without exposure, and control amid chaos. Williams met these challenges with the same discipline that had defined his rise. He did not dominate the cocaine trade loudly or visibly. Instead, he integrated it into an existing system designed to absorb change. In the quiet moments, as Baltimore's nights grew busier and more dangerous, Melvin Williams continued to operate with calm precision. Others chased the future recklessly. He waited, adjusted, and endured. The cocaine shift marked not just a change in substance, but a proving ground for his methods. And once again, his commitment to patience over impulse allowed him to remain standing while the ground shifted beneath everyone else. By the mid-1980s, the quiet scrutiny surrounding Melvin Williams had evolved into something more focused, more deliberate. What had once been fragmented suspicion now carried the weight of institutional commitment. Federal agencies, drawn by the scale and resilience of Baltimore's drug trade, began to invest significant resources into understanding how it functioned and who stood at its center. Williams, long accustomed to moving beneath attention, now found himself under a microscope he could not see but could certainly feel. This new phase was defined less by street arrests and more by patience. Federal investigators understood that dismantling an operation like Williams would require time. They studied patterns rather than incidents, tracing relationships instead of chasing individuals. Long hours were spent reviewing financial records, monitoring communications, and building profiles based on behavior rather than hearsay. It was a slow process, one designed to outlast the subject rather than confront him directly. Wiretaps became a central tool. Phones were monitored, conversations recorded, and transcripts analyzed line by line. Yet the results were often frustrating. Williams' communication style offered little in the way of direct evidence. Conversations were brief, coded, or deliberately vague. Words carried meaning only to those already informed. To outsiders, they sounded mundane, even boring. Investigators found themselves sifting through hours of recordings that revealed nothing actionable. Informants, once relied upon heavily, proved equally unreliable. Some offered information colored by personal grudges or exaggerated claims. Others provided fragments that could not be corroborated. Williams' compartmentalized structure limited the damage any single informant could inflict. Even those close to certain operations lacked a complete picture. This fragmentation forced investigators to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces, a task that consumed time and tested patience. Surveillance efforts extended beyond individuals to locations. Buildings were watched, routines documented, and movements tracked. Yet again, Williams' ordinariness worked in his favor. There were no conspicuous gatherings, no suspicious deliveries, no visible signs of coordination. His movements blended seamlessly into the city's rhythms. To observe him was to observe normalcy, a fact that complicated efforts to justify continued surveillance. As the investigation deepened, the psychological pressure increased on both sides. For investigators, the lack of tangible progress created frustration and doubt. Years of work produced theories but few convictions. For Williams, the awareness of sustained attention demanded constant vigilance. He adjusted routines, limited exposure, and reinforced discipline across his network. The system he had built was designed for moments like this, but even the strongest systems require maintenance under pressure. The federal approach differed from local law enforcement in both scope and persistence. Where local agencies were often forced to prioritize immediate concerns, federal investigators could afford to wait. They believed that time would reveal inconsistencies, that financial trails would surface, that someone, eventually, would make a mistake. This belief sustained the investigation even as evidence remained elusive. Williams responded by leaning further into his philosophy of minimalism. He reduced direct involvement wherever possible, delegating responsibilities and trusting established protocols. Meetings became rarer, communication channels narrower. He avoided patterns that could be exploited, understanding that predictability, once useful, could become a liability under sustained scrutiny. Financial investigations emerged as a parallel track. Authorities began examining assets, expenditures, and income sources, searching for discrepancies that could support charges even if drug offenses could not be proven. Williams anticipated this shift. His financial discipline, long practiced, now served as a critical defense. Transactions were structured to avoid obvious red flags, and lifestyles were kept within plausible limits. Despite these precautions, the weight of attention was unavoidable. Associates sensed it too, and not all responded with the same composure. Some grew anxious, others careless. Williams managed these dynamics carefully, offering reassurance while tightening controls. He understood that fear could be as dangerous as arrogance. Maintaining calm within the network was essential to preventing mistakes. The investigation's intensity also influenced Williams' perception of time. Each day without action was both a relief and a reminder. Relief that the system had not yet succeeded, and a reminder that it was still trying. He did not assume invincibility. Instead, he treated survival as an ongoing process, requiring continuous adaptation. For investigators, the challenge became one of endurance. They were convinced of Williams' central role, yet conviction without proof offered little satisfaction. Courtrooms demanded evidence, not belief. The gap between suspicion and proof loomed large, shaping strategies and testing resolve. This period marked a turning point in the relationship between Williams and the system. The contest was no longer about evasion alone, but about outlasting an opponent with far greater resources. Williams relied on discipline, structure, and patience. The system relied on persistence, analysis, and time. Neither side rushed. Both waited. As months turned into years, the investigation matured. Patterns emerged, even if they could not yet be formalized. Investigators felt closer than ever, though still out of reach. Williams felt the pressure but remained composed, trusting the methods that had carried him this far. The federal eye, once distant, was now firmly fixed. What would come next was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the quiet phase was ending. The groundwork had been laid for a confrontation that would test everything Williams had built. The question was no longer whether the system would act, but how, and when. As the investigation reached its most mature stage, the sense of inevitability began to settle in, not with urgency, but with weight. Years of observation, documentation, and quiet frustration had funneled toward a single moment. By 1987, the federal government was ready to make its move. What had once been a distant, almost abstract pursuit now took on a formal shape. Indictments were drafted, strategies finalized, and careers quietly staked on the outcome. For prosecutors and investigators alike, this was no longer just a case. It was a reckoning. In Baltimore, word traveled carefully. Those attuned to the underground felt the shift before it was publicly announced. The atmosphere tightened. Conversations shortened. Movements became more deliberate. Melvin Williams sensed it too. Not through official notice, but through subtle changes in the environment he had spent decades learning to read. The quiet patience of the federal investigation had reached its conclusion. The system was ready to test whether discipline and restraint could withstand its full weight. The charges, when they came, carried the gravity of years invested. Prosecutors believed they had assembled enough evidence to finally pierce the armor that had protected Williams for so long. Witnesses had been lined up. Financial records scrutinized. Recorded conversations interpreted and reinterpreted. The case was presented not as a single incident, but as a comprehensive portrait of an alleged criminal enterprise. It was ambitious, complex, and, in the minds of those bringing it forward, overdue. Courtrooms prepared for a trial that promised to draw attention well beyond Baltimore. This was not a street-level prosecution. It was an attempt to dismantle a figure long suspected of shaping the city's drug economy from the shadows. For law enforcement, the trial represented validation. Years of work would finally be tested under the harsh clarity of legal scrutiny. Success would justify the patience. Failure would raise uncomfortable questions. Williams approached the moment without outward reaction. There were no public statements, no visible signs of anxiety. Those who knew him well noticed no change in demeanor. This calm was not performative. It was the product of long preparation. He had always understood that this moment was possible, even likely. Every decision he had made was influenced by the assumption that one day, the system would try to confront him directly. Defense preparations moved quietly but decisively. Williams' legal team focused on what had always protected him, ambiguity. The prosecution's case, though expansive, relied heavily on interpretation rather than direct evidence. Conversations were suggestive, not explicit. Associations were implied, not documented. Witnesses, many with compromised credibility, would be subjected to scrutiny of their own. The defense strategy was not to deny everything, but to challenge certainty itself. As the trial date approached, the city watched with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. To many residents, this was just another case in a long line of drug prosecutions. The deeper significance was understood only by those familiar with the investigation's history. For them, the trial carried symbolic weight. It represented the possibility that even the most elusive figures could be brought into the light. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was controlled but tense. Prosecutors presented their narrative methodically, outlining what they believed to be Williams' central role in Baltimore's drug trade. They spoke of organization, hierarchy, and influence. Evidence was introduced piece by piece, each fragment intended to contribute to a larger picture. Witnesses testified, some confidently, others cautiously, their words echoing through the room. The defense responded with equal deliberation. They questioned the reliability of witnesses, highlighting inconsistencies and motivations. They emphasized the absence of direct proof, the lack of tangible connections tying Williams to specific criminal acts. Each challenge chipped away at the prosecution's narrative, introducing doubt where certainty was required. Williams himself remained composed throughout. He listened attentively, rarely reacting. This stillness was striking. In a room charged with expectation, his calm presence unsettled some observers. It was difficult to reconcile the image of a powerful criminal mastermind with the man seated quietly, offering no spectacle. As days passed, the trial unfolded like a slow-burning drama. There were no dramatic revelations, no sudden confessions. Instead, the case hinged on interpretation. Jurors were asked to infer intent, to connect dots that were deliberately spaced apart. The prosecution trusted that the accumulation of evidence would speak for itself. The defense trusted that gaps and ambiguities would prove decisive. Outside the courtroom, speculation flourished. Some believed conviction was inevitable, citing the sheer scale of the allegations. Others doubted the system's ability to prove what it suspected. The city's history offered reasons for skepticism. Powerful figures had slipped through before. The outcome was far from certain. For Williams, the trial was not about vindication or defiance. It was about endurance. He understood that trials were not just legal contests, but tests of narrative. The system sought to define him in clear terms. He had spent his life resisting definition. His strategy now was the same as it had always been: remain controlled, remain consistent, and allow the process to reveal its own limitations. As closing arguments approached, tension peaked. Prosecutors emphasized the breadth of their case, urging jurors to see the whole rather than focus on individual gaps. The defense reminded them that the law required proof beyond reasonable doubt, not suspicion, not belief. The distinction mattered. When the case was finally handed to the jury, the room exhaled collectively. Years of investigation, months of preparation, and weeks of testimony now rested in the hands of a small group tasked with weighing complexity against certainty. For law enforcement, it was a moment of vulnerability. For Williams, it was the culmination of a lifetime spent anticipating scrutiny. Whatever the outcome, the trial marked a turning point. The quiet war had stepped into the open, and its resolution would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. As the jury deliberated, Baltimore waited, suspended between expectation and uncertainty, aware that something significant was unfolding, even if its full meaning had yet to be revealed. Sectio. When the jury returned, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. Weeks of testimony, years of investigation, and decades of quiet suspicion had funneled into this moment. People leaned forward, breaths held, waiting for a resolution that many believed had already been decided long before the trial began. The federal government had come with confidence, armed with an expansive narrative. What followed would challenge that certainty. The verdict did not arrive with drama or flourish. It arrived calmly, almost anticlimactically, yet its impact rippled outward immediately. Melvin Williams was acquitted. The words settled into the room slowly, as if they needed time to be understood. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then came subtle reactions, raised eyebrows, exchanged glances, restrained sighs. For prosecutors, it was a shock that cut deeper because it was quiet. For investigators, it was a realization that years of work had ended without the outcome they believed inevitable. Williams himself showed little reaction. He did not smile or celebrate. He absorbed the verdict with the same composure that had defined his presence throughout the trial. This restraint only deepened the sense of disbelief among observers. A man so widely suspected, so carefully pursued, had once again slipped through the system's grasp. The courtroom, designed to produce finality, instead produced ambiguity. Outside, reactions were mixed. Some saw the acquittal as a failure of justice, a confirmation that the system could not contain those who understood it too well. Others viewed it as a reminder of the legal standard that governed even the most emotionally charged cases. Proof, not suspicion, was the currency of conviction. In Williams' case, the prosecution's narrative had not been enough to overcome the gaps. For law enforcement, the verdict was deeply unsettling. Years of surveillance, wiretaps, and informant cultivation had produced a case that felt compelling internally, yet insufficient legally. The realization forced a painful reckoning. They had believed they understood Williams, but the trial exposed how little they could actually prove. The system had played by its own rules, and those rules had favored the man they sought to dismantle. Williams' acquittal did not erase suspicion. It intensified it. Investigators did not suddenly believe him innocent. Instead, they believed him more formidable. He had not only evaded detection but survived direct confrontation. This outcome reshaped how he was perceived within law enforcement circles. He was no longer just a suspected organizer. He was a symbol of the limits of traditional prosecution. Within the underground, the verdict carried its own meaning. Williams' survival reinforced his reputation for discipline and foresight. To some, it confirmed that his methods worked. To others, it served as a warning that attention, once earned, never fully fades. Williams himself understood this better than anyone. Acquittal did not mean freedom from scrutiny. It meant a shift in tactics, both his and theirs. In the days that followed, prosecutors publicly accepted the verdict while privately reassessing their approach. Some questioned whether the case had been brought too soon. Others wondered if the structure they were trying to prove was simply too diffuse to capture in court. The trial had revealed a gap between investigative belief and legal proof that could not be bridged by effort alone. Williams returned to his life without ceremony. There were no public statements, no gestures of triumph. He resumed routines that appeared unchanged, though the context around them had shifted dramatically. The experience reinforced lessons he had learned long ago: the system was powerful, but not infallible. Preparation mattered. Patience mattered. Silence mattered most of all. Yet the acquittal carried consequences beyond vindication. It placed Williams under a different kind of spotlight. The federal government rarely accepts defeat as final. Attention turned toward alternative strategies. If drug charges could not be proven, perhaps financial ones could. If direct evidence was lacking, indirect approaches might succeed. The system began to adjust, quietly recalibrating its focus. For Williams, this was not unexpected. He had always assumed that survival would invite renewed scrutiny. The challenge was not to celebrate victory, but to manage its aftermath. Acquittal could breed complacency, both within an organization and within oneself. Williams resisted that temptation. He tightened controls, reduced exposure, and treated the verdict not as an end, but as a temporary reprieve. Public perception remained fragmented. To many, Williams' name still carried weight, though details were scarce. The trial had brought him briefly into view, but the lack of conviction left the public without closure. Stories circulated, some exaggerated, others incomplete. Myth and reality blurred further, complicating any attempt to define him clearly. Within legal circles, the case became a reference point. It was discussed as an example of the challenges inherent in prosecuting sophisticated, insulated figures. The lessons were sobering. Success required not just suspicion, but undeniable proof. And some structures, built carefully over time, were designed specifically to avoid leaving such proof behind. As weeks turned into months, the immediate shock faded, but the implications endured. Williams remained free, yet far from untouched. The system, wounded but not defeated, continued to watch. The acquittal had not ended the quiet war. It had merely shifted its terrain. For Williams, the experience affirmed his worldview. He had built his life around the assumption that scrutiny was inevitable. The trial validated his methods, but also reminded him of the margins within which he operated. One misstep, one careless moment, could have altered the outcome entirely. The verdict of 1987 would come to define his story in the public imagination. It marked the moment when the system appeared to falter, when a man widely believed to be at the center of Baltimore's drug trade walked free. Yet for those who understood the deeper dynamics at play, it was not an ending. It was a pause. A moment of stillness before the next movement in a long and complex narrative. In the quiet aftermath, as life resumed its outward normalcy, one truth remained clear. Melvin Williams had outsmarted the system, not by defying it openly, but by understanding it deeply. And that understanding ensured that the story was far from over. Even after the acquittal of 1987, victory did not come to Melvin Williams in the form of celebration or relief. For him, it was a quiet, heavy triumph, marked less by the applause of others and more by the awareness of what he had narrowly avoided. Walking out of the courtroom free, while most would consider it the culmination of years of effort and patience, for Williams it was only another phase in a long and ongoing journey. The win brought with it its own weight, a subtle, persistent reminder that freedom and power are never permanent, and that attention, once earned, rarely dissipates. Publicly, the acquittal was framed as a legal resolution. To the casual observer, it might have seemed that Williams had defeated the system and resumed his life unchanged. But in reality, the consequences of having attracted the full gaze of the federal government were profound. Investigators, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials had taken years to understand the scale of his operations. Though they had failed to convict him this time, their knowledge and vigilance had only deepened. The scrutiny did not vanish. If anything, it intensified in subtle ways. Every step he took, every business move, every interaction with his network was now measured against the possibility that the system was watching more closely than ever before. Williams understood this implicitly. His philosophy of control, cultivated over decades, demanded vigilance in the face of new pressures. Victory in court did not translate to immunity. He had long known that success in the underground economy required a balance between visibility and invisibility, influence and discretion. Walking free was not the endgame, it was a temporary pause that demanded recalibration. While others might have basked in triumph, he used the moment to tighten operations, review structures, and anticipate the next challenge. The acquittal also highlighted a paradox in his life: the more successfully he navigated the legal system, the more isolated he became. Friends and associates often misinterpreted the outcome, celebrating it with reckless enthusiasm. Williams knew that such displays, however well-intentioned, could attract unwanted attention or provoke vulnerability. He continued to emphasize discipline within his network, reinforcing the importance of patience, order, and discretion. Success in the street economy, he believed, was not measured by headlines or short-term gains, but by longevity. The courtroom had confirmed that his approach worked, but it also underscored how precarious that balance could be. Internally, Williams likely grappled with the tension between relief and awareness. Walking out a free man meant that his judgment, preparation, and restraint had been sufficient to withstand the most focused scrutiny the federal system could bring. Yet the weight of that knowledge was not liberating. He understood that future confrontations were inevitable, that the system rarely accepted defeat as final. Freedom came with strings attached. He had to remain disciplined, cautious, and adaptive, because the victory of 1987 was not a guarantee of permanence, it was a temporary reprieve in an ongoing contest. For law enforcement, the acquittal became a humbling moment. Their investment in years of surveillance, informants, and legal preparation had produced a narrative compelling enough to convince many, but not legally sufficient to secure a conviction. The inability to definitively prove the case against Williams highlighted both the limits of the system and the sophistication of the man they sought to contain. The verdict forced them to reassess their strategies, refine methods, and consider alternative avenues to achieve accountability. They had witnessed a man operate at the edge of legality with an intelligence and discipline that few could match. Williams' ability to outmaneuver the system did more than frustrate law enforcement, it reshaped how he was perceived both inside and outside his network. To his associates, the acquittal reinforced his authority. It was proof that his methods, quiet, patient, calculated, were effective. Those who might have doubted his discipline now had evidence of his strategic genius. Loyalty and respect were strengthened not through intimidation, but through the demonstration of foresight and mastery over forces that others had struggled to navigate. Yet the period following his acquittal was not marked by complacency. Williams recognized that survival in the underground economy required continual assessment and adaptation. He knew that federal authorities, though temporarily thwarted, were persistent. New approaches would emerge, and vulnerabilities might appear if his focus wavered. The years of attention leading up to the trial had shown him the thoroughness and patience of his adversaries. This knowledge demanded vigilance in every aspect of his life: financial management, operational control, personal conduct, and the behavior of those closest to him. The acquittal also created a psychological contrast that Williams would have felt acutely. On one hand, he had survived the apex of legal scrutiny, an extraordinary achievement by any measure. On the other hand, the awareness that the system would continue to seek leverage over him created a persistent, low-level tension. He had won a battle, but not the war. Every victory was immediately contextualized by the understanding that success brought new responsibilities, pressures, and dangers. The freedom he had achieved came with the implicit knowledge that the system would adapt, that surveillance would persist, and that the potential for exposure remained ever present. Community perception, meanwhile, became layered and complex. Among those outside the legal system, Williams' acquittal created a mixture of awe, speculation, and concern. In some circles, he was elevated into near mythical status, a man who had outsmarted the system and emerged unscathed. In others, the acquittal reinforced fears about the reach of the underground economy and the challenges law enforcement faced. For Williams, these external perceptions were largely irrelevant to day-to-day operations, yet they underscored the delicate balance he had to maintain. Reputation was a tool, but it could also become a liability if it attracted unnecessary scrutiny. Following the trial, Williams continued to operate with the same philosophy that had sustained him for decades. He avoided ostentatious displays of wealth, maintained disciplined operational practices, and reinforced the principles of restraint and reliability among his network. His victory in court did not embolden reckless behavior. Instead, it reinforced the efficacy of patience, discretion, and control. Every decision was still informed by the understanding that survival depended on anticipating risks, mitigating exposure, and managing human behavior as carefully as any financial ledger. Financial scrutiny, though not immediately punitive, became a more significant factor in the aftermath of the trial. Federal authorities, frustrated by their inability to secure convictions on drug charges, increasingly explored alternative approaches. Tax laws, financial discrepancies, and indirect evidence became areas of renewed focus. Williams, aware of these potential vulnerabilities, likely refined his strategies for managing resources, separating personal finances from operational ones, and ensuring that his visible life remained insulated from the underlying business. In essence, the 1987 acquittal was both a confirmation and a warning. It confirmed the effectiveness of his methods, demonstrating that patience, discipline, and discretion could outlast the most concentrated legal pressure. It also served as a warning that attention, once drawn, rarely fades completely. The victory was quiet, heavy, and measured, mirroring the approach that had carried him through years of careful navigation. In this balance of achievement and vigilance, Williams embodied a principle that would define his life: true power is exercised not through spectacle or aggression, but through foresight, composure, and unyielding control of oneself and one's environment. Even in freedom, he remained acutely aware that the systems had been trained on him, and that its persistence was enduring. The aftermath of the trial required not celebration, but careful recalibration, a continual adjustment of tactics to maintain advantage in a landscape where scrutiny never fully dissipated. The acquittal was a victory, yes, but it was also a pivot, a reminder that in a world of systems and surveillance, the game was never truly over, and survival demanded unbroken attention, quiet strategy, and the same patience that had defined his rise from the shadows. Even after the acquittal, the attention of the federal government did not wane. In fact, Melvin Williams' very survival under scrutiny seemed to sharpen the focus on him. Federal investigators are rarely satisfied with near misses. Years of effort, resources, and personnel investment create a kind of inertia that compels continuation. The system rarely forgets, especially when it has dedicated itself to a singular pursuit. Williams had outmaneuvered them in 1987, but they were patient, and patience, when wielded by institutions, can be formidable. The months and years following his acquittal became a period of strategic recalibration, both for him and for the authorities who had failed to secure a conviction. Federal agencies turned to a new angle: financial accountability. They recognized that dismantling an organization of Williams' scale through conventional drug charges had proved difficult. Direct evidence tying him to transactions had been elusive, and witnesses had proven unreliable. Yet financial records, bank statements, and tax filings offered a subtler, more legally sustainable route. If a man earns substantial wealth but fails to report it properly, the law offers a different kind of leverage, one less dependent on the ambiguity of hearsay or interpretation. This approach had historical precedent. Al Capone had famously been brought down not for his criminal acts, but for tax violations. The lesson was clear: a kingpin could be constrained through financial scrutiny, even if the streets themselves remained opaque. Williams understood this shift instinctively. He had long prioritized financial discipline, carefully insulating his resources from exposure. Wealth was not flaunted. Accounts were structured to reduce traceability. Transactions were deliberate and calculated. Yet the very fact that authorities were now concentrating on financial irregularities meant that no system, however meticulously designed, was entirely immune. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was small. Williams approached this challenge with the same methodical composure that had carried him through the previous years of surveillance and trial. The federal government, meanwhile, began building an intricate web of surveillance focused not only on overt operations but also on patterns of personal behavior. Who he associated with, where he spent time, how resources were allocated, all became potential avenues for insight. Informants were recruited with promises of reduced sentences or immunity, a strategy aimed at penetrating the layers of compartmentalization Williams had carefully constructed. Wiretaps, previously yielding minimal actionable intelligence, were now supplemented with financial monitoring and observation of mundane routines. Every detail, however ordinary it seemed, was scrutinized. In the world of federal investigations, the ordinary often contains the extraordinary. For Williams, the challenge was both operational and psychological. Having navigated an intense trial and emerged acquitted, he was acutely aware of the system's persistence. Victory in court did not erase vulnerability. Every meeting, transaction, and movement had to be evaluated for risk. The margin for error was thinner than ever. His philosophy of control, discipline, patience, and discretion remained essential, but it now required heightened vigilance. Associates had to be managed carefully, communication channels tightened, and exposure minimized without disrupting the functional integrity of the operation. The era also highlighted a shift in the broader landscape of Baltimore's underground. New entrants into the drug trade, particularly those involved with the emerging cocaine market, brought volatility. Many operated aggressively, flaunting wealth, engaging in public disputes, and attracting attention. Williams' approach, honed through years of patience and strategic observation, contrasted sharply. While others were consumed by immediate gains and visible dominance, he continued to operate quietly, ensuring the resilience and sustainability of his organization. This methodical approach not only shielded him from law enforcement but also reinforced loyalty among those who valued stability and predictability. Federal investigators recognized this resilience and adjusted their tactics accordingly. They could no longer rely on reactive strategies, arrests prompted by visible incidents or informant tips. Instead, they sought patterns, structural weaknesses, and long-term inconsistencies that might expose vulnerabilities. Every documented interaction, financial record, and behavioral pattern became a potential puzzle piece. Analysts and agents invested countless hours attempting to assemble these fragments into a coherent case. To those within the system, Williams had become less a person and more a challenge, an operational problem requiring patience, ingenuity, and the ability to anticipate adaptation. For Williams, understanding the federal perspective became another tool. He anticipated the methods likely to be employed against him and adapted accordingly. Meetings were further compartmentalized, cash flows refined, and associates carefully monitored for behavior that might compromise operational security. This period of adjustment was as much about reinforcing internal discipline as it was about reacting externally. Survival in this environment demanded constant attention and foresight. At the same time, Williams had to navigate the tension between power and perception. The more adeptly he insulated himself from scrutiny, the more mysterious he appeared to outsiders. Law enforcement, unable to directly penetrate his operation, often relied on conjecture and inference. Within his network, this perception enhanced his authority, reinforcing loyalty and respect. Yet it also brought a subtle burden: every move, no matter how carefully calculated, was now potentially interpreted as evidence or signal. In this high-stakes environment, operational discretion was inseparable from personal discipline. As federal scrutiny intensified, Williams' ability to remain undetected became a demonstration of strategic mastery. His operations continued to function effectively, yet he became increasingly aware of the need to evolve alongside investigative methods. Flexibility, always central to his approach, was now exercised not just to capitalize on market opportunities but to maintain resilience under pressure. Adaptation was not optional, it was survival. The psychological implications of sustained surveillance were profound. Investigators often felt frustration, operating for months or years without conclusive outcomes. For Williams, the pressure of being perpetually watched introduced a different kind of tension, one that required constant vigilance but could never allow panic. Maintaining composure became a defensive strategy as much as a philosophical choice. This discipline allowed him to operate efficiently while the system sought leverage over him. Financial investigations continued to form the backbone of federal strategy. Williams had anticipated such an approach, yet it was impossible to be entirely insulated. The years following Melvin Williams' 1987 acquittal marked a new phase in both his life and the government's pursuit. While he had eluded conviction on drug charges, federal authorities were far from finished. Their focus shifted toward a domain that was deceptively simple, yet legally potent: financial accountability. The principle was straightforward: If a man earns substantial income from illicit activity and fails to report it to the Internal Revenue Service, the law can intervene even when drug-related charges cannot be proven. It was a lesson the country had learned during the era of Al Capone, a lesson Williams was acutely aware of, and yet one that would ultimately prove unavoidable. Williams' financial footprint had been meticulously managed for years. Profits were carefully channeled through intermediaries, hidden behind layers of legal and pseudo-legal structures, with cash flow insulated from direct scrutiny. He had always prioritized operational security, understanding that the appearance of legitimacy could be just as powerful as actual compliance. Yet the government's strategy now forced attention on a different battlefield, one where meticulous attention to detail was no longer optional, but essential for continued survival. Investigators and prosecutors turned their focus to tax filings, bank accounts, and financial behaviors that could suggest unreported income. They scrutinized patterns of spending, property acquisition, and the movement of funds through third parties. Whereas previous drug investigations had been hampered by the difficulty of linking Williams directly to narcotics transactions, the financial approach relied on documentation rather than inference. Each missed or misreported transaction could form the basis of a prosecutable case. This shift altered the dynamics significantly. The focus was no longer on establishing guilt through implication, but on proving violation through concrete numbers and accounts. Williams, aware of the inevitability of this new approach, did not panic. He had spent decades understanding the systemic pressures around him, and this was simply another challenge to manage. His response was measured, methodical, and rooted in the discipline that had always defined him. Transactions were further compartmentalized. Personal expenditures were minimized. Financial exposure was tightened, not through secrecy alone, but through carefully structured practices designed to withstand legal scrutiny. He understood that in this domain, even minor lapses could be fatal, and that long-term security required both foresight and precision. For the federal authorities, the advantage lay in their patience. Unlike the immediate pressures of street-level enforcement or high-profile drug investigations, financial cases could unfold slowly, deliberately, and methodically. Investigators could track patterns over months or years, piecing together evidence from multiple sources, cross-referencing statements, deposits, and property records. Even small anomalies could become significant when viewed within the larger context. It was a war of endurance, favoring the side willing to wait and analyze without distraction. The psychological dimension of this period was significant. Williams had already endured the intense scrutiny of trial and surveillance. The knowledge that federal investigators were now scrutinizing financial details added a new layer of complexity. Every account, every transaction, and even the timing of expenditures required careful consideration. Yet Williams' strength lay in his ability to operate under continuous pressure without panic. His organizational structures, built for resilience and discretion, became more critical than ever. Associates were reminded, subtly but firmly, of the importance of following protocols, maintaining discretion, and avoiding exposure. At the same time, this phase revealed an interesting contrast between perception and reality. To outsiders, Williams' life remained outwardly calm and controlled. There were no public spectacles, no dramatic ostentatious displays of wealth. Yet beneath this surface, the stakes had never been higher. The government's focus on financial irregularities was relentless precisely because it could be precise. Unlike the drug trials, where evidence often hinged on testimony or inference, financial investigations were grounded in tangible records. The margin for error was narrow, and even small oversights could be magnified in court. This period also highlighted the strategic interplay between legal and operational foresight. Williams understood that he could not rely solely on past practices. Even structures that had been effective for years required evaluation and adaptation under new scrutiny. Financial management became both a protective mechanism and an operational necessity. He reinforced separation between personal assets and operational funds, monitored intermediaries carefully, and ensured that visible transactions aligned with legal expectations while protecting underlying operations. It was a balancing act requiring constant attention, foresight, and an almost surgical precision in execution. The government's approach, by its nature, was indirect. Investigators were not primarily concerned with the daily operations of the drug trade at this point. Instead, they focused on what could be proven and quantified: assets, taxes, and compliance with financial regulations. Their patient accumulation of evidence created pressure that was subtle but pervasive. While Williams had survived courtroom drama in 1987, he now faced a type of scrutiny that could not be easily countered through charisma, composure, or strategic silence. The law was procedural, methodical, and relentless, and it operated on a timeline that favored patience and precision over urgency and force. Community perception of Williams during this period remained layered. Within Baltimore's underground networks, his reputation for foresight, discipline, and resilience was strengthened by his ability to evade legal consequences repeatedly. Outside those networks, however, the narrative was more complex. Public discourse framed him as a powerful criminal who had repeatedly outmaneuvered the justice system, creating an aura of invincibility. This perception, while partially accurate, masked the constant vigilance, meticulous planning, and careful decision-making required to maintain that status. Power, in his world, was as much about preparation and foresight as it was about control over others. By the late 1980s, the financial investigation began yielding results that drug-related prosecutions had not. The system, patient and methodical, slowly constructed a framework of evidence that Williams could not fully insulate himself from. Tax evasion, misreported income, and other financial irregularities became the legal pathways through which authorities could pursue accountability. These charges were narrower in scope than drug trafficking accusations, yet no less consequential. They demonstrated a critical principle: even the most disciplined operator, capable of outmaneuvering legal strategies for years, was not beyond the reach of a patient, procedural system. Williams' response to this emerging reality exemplified the duality of his life. Outwardly, he maintained calm, continued daily routines, and reinforced operational discipline within his organization. Inwardly, he navigated one of the most delicate periods of his career. Each transaction, each decision, carried both practical and symbolic weight. Every step required balancing operational efficiency with the necessity of minimizing exposure. The stakes were not abstract, they were tangible, immediate, and potentially transformative. Ultimately, the period marked by financial scrutiny and tax-related charges underscored a fundamental truth about power and survival in Williams' world. Discipline, foresight, and restraint could delay confrontation and mitigate risk, but they could not render one entirely immune to systemic pressure. The federal system, patient and adaptable, could find avenues where direct evidence was lacking. Williams' story during this period was not one of sudden downfall, but of the quiet recalibration that defines enduring strategy, a recognition that threats evolve, that methods must adapt, and that even a life of careful control exists within the constraints imposed by larger institutional forces. This era laid the groundwork for the next chapter of his life, in which careful navigation of legal, operational, and psychological pressures would continue to define his influence. His mastery of patience, discretion, and strategic foresight remained his greatest asset, but it was tested now in ways that were less visible, more procedural, and fundamentally unavoidable. It was a reminder that even the most disciplined, intelligent, and careful individual must continually adapt to the persistence of the system, and that survival is not defined by a single victory, but by the consistent management of risk over time. Prison is often portrayed in popular culture as a place defined by chaos, violence, and constant upheaval, yet for Melvin Williams, it represented something profoundly different, a controlled environment in which patience, observation, and discipline became not just tools of survival, but a means of adaptation. When he was finally incarcerated following convictions related to financial charges and other indirect legal strategies, the world outside shifted unpredictably, but the principles that had guided him throughout his rise remained just as relevant within the walls of a federal penitentiary. Here, in an environment designed to strip autonomy and impose structure, Williams' understanding of systems and human behavior became his most vital asset. The first realization for someone like Williams entering prison is the sheer scale of control exercised over every aspect of daily life. From wake-up calls to meal times, from work assignments to restricted movements, the schedule is regimented, leaving very little room for improvisation. To many, this lack of freedom is debilitating, a constant reminder of vulnerability and dependence. Williams, however, approached it analytically. He recognized that within the rigid framework of the institution, there existed patterns and hierarchies, rules to navigate, behaviors to observe, and influence to cultivate in subtle ways. What appeared to outsiders as restriction, he perceived as predictable structure, and predictability, in his view, is a form of security. Observation became a central practice during these years. Williams paid careful attention to the routines of staff, the tendencies of fellow inmates, and the social currents that shifted quietly within the prison population. He noticed how authority operated, who gained informal respect, and how alliances were formed and dissolved. Every conversation, every interaction, every unspoken reaction was data. He catalogued it mentally, building a detailed understanding of a system that, while overtly constraining, contained complex social dynamics that could be anticipated and navigated with care. In this way, he remained active and aware, even in an environment designed to reduce activity to survival. Routine, discipline, and patience were magnified in significance within the prison setting. Unlike the streets, where unpredictability could be mitigated through mobility, prison demanded consistent awareness and careful adherence to rules, both formal and informal. Williams understood that a single misstep, a challenge to authority, a misjudged alliance, or an overreach in communication, could have immediate and severe consequences. Yet this necessity for caution also provided clarity. In a system stripped of chaos, measured action became the defining factor of influence. Even small gestures of composure or reliability could elevate one's position subtly, providing protection and agency in an otherwise rigid environment. Mental engagement became another crucial focus. While physical freedom was restricted, Williams maintained an active, analytical mind. He reflected on past decisions, considered future contingencies, and studied the behaviors of those around him with a strategic eye. Isolation and limitation of choice, circumstances that might frustrate or demoralize others, became, for him, an opportunity to refine his understanding of human behavior and operational control. He could observe outcomes, test theories, and mentally rehearse strategies for a world beyond the walls. In this way, prison became an extension of his learning, rather than a pause in it. Relationships, carefully managed, remained vital. Williams avoided unnecessary conflict, understanding that dominance in such an environment was less about brute force and more about social intelligence. Respect was earned through consistent behavior, reliability, and discretion. Inmates, like operators in the outside world, responded predictably to those who could maintain composure, mediate disputes, and navigate tensions without drawing undue attention. Williams' reputation, built over decades, carried forward even in this confined context, allowing him to influence outcomes quietly while maintaining personal security. Time, in prison, becomes a tangible factor. Days stretch, weeks accumulate, and years are measured in routine and observation. Williams' patience, honed during years of evading the system and managing complex networks, allowed him to endure these stretches without losing focus. Unlike those who succumb to frustration or impulsivity, he treated each day as part of a larger continuum. The monotony of prison, rather than weakening his resolve, reinforced his long-term perspective. Every hour could be used strategically, whether for reflection, observation, or subtle influence. The interplay between visibility and invisibility remained critical. Even in incarceration, there are individuals and groups who monitor behavior, look for weaknesses, and exploit opportunities. Williams understood that the less conspicuous one remained, the fewer the risks of entanglement. He navigated social interactions with discretion, participating enough to establish trust but not so much as to create unnecessary exposure. The principles of compartmentalization and controlled communication, already central to his operations outside, were now equally relevant within the walls of prison. Prison also provided insight into human resilience and adaptation. Williams observed the ways people coped with restriction, how hierarchies evolved in confined spaces, and how stress altered behavior over time. These observations were not merely academic, they informed his understanding of how networks functioned under pressure, a skill that would later translate back to the outside world. He saw firsthand that influence and control could persist even in highly constrained environments, provided one exercised patience, observation, and strategic discretion. Personal discipline extended to mental and physical maintenance. Williams avoided behaviors that might compromise his well-being or judgment. He maintained routines that preserved focus, avoided entanglement in disputes that offered no strategic benefit, and managed his time and energy carefully. This level of self-regulation was not innate, it had been cultivated over decades and now found full expression in a context designed to test it continuously. In many ways, prison became a crucible, refining the qualities that had allowed him to navigate Baltimore's underground so effectively. The lessons of this period were subtle but profound. Survival in prison was not about confrontation, it was about observation, adaptation, and the careful exercise of influence. The principles that had guided his rise, discipline, patience, foresight, and strategic control of human behavior, proved equally essential behind bars. Power was no longer measured by wealth or reach, but by the ability to navigate a highly constrained social and institutional system without creating vulnerabilities. By the time of his eventual release, Williams had emerged not just intact but sharpened. The years in prison had reinforced the importance of patience, discretion, and structural thinking. They had provided a controlled environment in which the principles that had guided his life could be tested, observed, and refined. He had learned to endure constant surveillance, navigate complex social hierarchies, and maintain mental acuity under pressure, lessons that would continue to shape his approach to influence, control, and adaptation in the outside world. In essence, the prison years underscored a central truth about Williams' life: true power is not merely the capacity to act, but the ability to survive, observe, and adapt within constraints, whether they be social, legal, or environmental. Even stripped of freedom, he remained a strategist, quietly mastering the dynamics around him and preserving his capacity to operate when the world beyond the walls called him back into its rhythm. Survival, in this context, became both a practice and a discipline, one that would define his legacy long after his release. After years behind bars, Melvin Williams' release marked not a return to his former life in the shadows, but a careful, deliberate reinvention. The world he returned to was different from the one he had left. Baltimore continued to shift socially, economically, and culturally. The streets were changing, new players had emerged, and the landscape of organized crime had evolved. For Williams, the question was no longer how to rise or survive, but how to navigate a world that had adapted in his absence. The same principles that had guided him in the past, patience, discipline, strategic observation, now needed to be applied in a new context, one where his past could be both a burden and a resource. Williams approached this period with the same analytical mindset that had defined his rise. He understood that overt engagement in criminal enterprise was now far more dangerous. Federal authorities had not forgotten, and the visibility associated with previous success created both legal and social liabilities. Instead of returning to the underground economy directly, he began to explore avenues that allowed him to leverage his experience while minimizing exposure. This approach required humility, foresight, and a deep understanding of human behavior, a skill set honed over decades. One avenue of reinvention was mentorship and guidance. Williams possessed knowledge that was rare, derived from first-hand experience in both operation and survival within complex networks. Younger individuals in the community, many facing the same systemic challenges he had encountered, looked for guidance, whether consciously or unconsciously. Williams' presence alone, disciplined and deliberate, offered a model of strategic thinking and calculated restraint. He could teach lessons about timing, patience, and the importance of observation without endorsing illegality outright. His influence shifted from direct control to indirect, advisory presence, a method both safer and enduring. In addition to mentorship, Williams explored creative outlets that allowed him to share his experience in controlled ways. Acting, for instance, offered a platform to translate aspects of his life into narrative form. His experiences inspired characters and storylines, allowing him to remain connected to the cultural conversation surrounding crime and urban life without the risks inherent in actual operations. This transition was subtle, requiring him to maintain credibility and discretion while participating in an industry that mirrored aspects of his past. It also provided a legitimate source of income, reinforcing the lesson that strategic adaptation could produce stability without exposure. Financial prudence remained central to this reinvention. Having survived both the streets and the legal system, Williams understood the importance of insulating assets and maintaining legitimacy in visible transactions. Investments, savings, and property management became critical tools, ensuring that personal security was maintained without creating unnecessary attention. Unlike the past, when financial maneuvers served to obscure the sources of illicit income, now they serve to provide stability and legal protection. This required a disciplined approach, balancing risk and reward carefully in a world where mistakes could have immediate consequences. Community perception also played a pivotal role. Williams' return was closely observed by those who remembered his past, as well as by a new generation unfamiliar with the subtleties of his influence. Managing perception became an exercise in subtlety. He could not openly flaunt past achievements without attracting scrutiny, yet remaining invisible entirely risked erasing the authority he had cultivated over decades. He navigated this tension through measured engagement. He maintained visibility where it was beneficial, emphasized mentorship and guidance, and avoided actions that would unnecessarily provoke attention. His reputation became a tool of influence, operating indirectly rather than coercively. The shift from underground operator to public figure in controlled spheres required recalibration of relationships. Associates from the past, once essential to operations, were now potential liabilities if interactions were not managed carefully. Williams had to reassess networks, retaining connections that provided mutual benefit while distancing himself from those that increased risk. This process was delicate, requiring insight into motivations, loyalties, and vulnerabilities. Strategic distancing was as important as engagement, and Williams applied the same analytical rigor to relationships as he had to operations. Mentally, the transition demanded resilience. Prison had instilled discipline and patience, but the post-release world required adaptation to ambiguity. The streets were no longer the same, the risks were different, and the legal environment was heightened. Williams relied on his capacity for observation, analyzing the environment before making moves. He understood that influence could be exerted without direct action and that patience often produced results more effectively than bold interventions. The ability to wait, assess, and act strategically remained a cornerstone of his approach. Cultural influence also became significant. Williams' life story, complex, disciplined, and marked by survival, provided insight into the structural dynamics of urban crime, systemic neglect, and strategic thinking under pressure. By participating in storytelling mediums such as acting and consulting, he contributed to a narrative that educated, informed, and engaged audiences, while simultaneously providing an outlet for experience without legal exposure. This transition reflected an evolution from operational control to narrative influence, allowing him to maintain relevance while reducing vulnerability. The legal dimension continued to shape behavior. Federal authorities maintained interest in his activities, even indirectly, requiring ongoing caution. Every transaction, association, and public appearance was evaluated for potential risk. Williams' prior experience with law enforcement had honed his capacity for foresight. He understood that the system could be patient, methodical, and persistent. Navigating this environment required the same discipline that had protected him for decades: restraint in speech, careful management of associations, and calculated visibility. Social dynamics within Baltimore were also evolving. New players in the drug trade and local power structures had emerged, bringing volatility and unpredictability. Williams' choice to focus on mentorship, controlled engagement, and cultural influence allowed him to maintain authority without becoming entangled in conflicts he could no longer safely navigate. Influence, in this phase, was exerted through reputation, insight, and guidance rather than direct operational control. Over time, this period of reinvention demonstrated the enduring value of strategic patience. Williams had learned that survival and influence were not synonymous with overt dominance. Real power often manifested subtly, through indirect control, foresight, and the ability to shape outcomes without visible action. By recalibrating his life to prioritize these principles, he could maintain relevance and authority while mitigating exposure to risk. Ultimately, Melvin Williams' post-release reinvention illustrates a profound lesson in adaptation. He did not attempt to recreate past glories, nor did he retreat entirely from influence. Instead, he transformed experience into guidance, operational insight into cultural contribution, and vigilance into strategic discipline. This phase of his life reflects a deliberate shift from direct power to indirect influence, demonstrating that mastery is not only about action but about knowing when, where, and how to act, or, importantly, when to wait. In navigating a changed world, Williams exemplified the principle that enduring influence depends not on the audacity of movement, but on the wisdom to adapt, recalibrate, and persist. Melvin Williams' life story, though marked by clandestine operations, legal scrutiny, and years of careful calculation, ultimately extended beyond the tangible streets of Baltimore and into the cultural imagination. One of the most fascinating aspects of his post-incarceration life was the way his experiences informed media portrayals of urban crime, most notably his influence on the creation of Avon Barksdale, a central character in The Wire. This transformation, from real-world kingpin to fictional archetype, illustrates the intersection of lived experience, narrative interpretation, and cultural memory, as well as Williams' own ability to navigate and shape perception even outside direct operational control. The process began subtly. Producers, writers, and directors were drawn to Baltimore not merely as a city, but as a living case study of the urban drug trade, systemic challenges, and complex human networks that operated both inside and outside the law. Williams' name, reputation, and carefully cultivated strategies became a touchstone. Those studying the city's social and criminal structures could see in him a blueprint for authority, patience, and calculated influence. Unlike many figures dramatized in crime media, Williams embodied a combination of intellect, strategic foresight, and restraint that made him compelling both as a subject of study and as a narrative inspiration. Williams' contribution to The Wire was more than anecdotal. He provided authenticity, insight, and a subtle advisory role that informed how characters were developed and how the world they inhabited was portrayed. His experiences with hierarchy, risk management, and operational discipline shaped the depiction of Avon Barksdale's organization. Writers sought to capture the precision, patience, and structured methodology that defined Williams' approach to the drug trade, highlighting that power is often exercised quietly, without spectacle, and with a keen understanding of human behavior. Barksdale's calm authority, strategic patience, and focus on systematized operations mirrored many of Williams' real-world philosophies, translating lived experience into narrative logic. The inspiration extended beyond operational tactics. It was also psychological. Williams' awareness of the constant presence of law enforcement, his strategic management of risk, and his nuanced understanding of loyalty, trust, and perception were all elements embedded in Barksdale's characterization. The Wire does not glamorize crime, but it does explore the structures, relationships, and pressures that define the criminal ecosystem. Williams' lived reality provided a template for this exploration, emphasizing the difference between visibility and influence, impulse and strategy, chaos and control. Through Barksdale, audiences could glimpse the careful, disciplined mind behind the myths of criminal dominance. What makes this intersection particularly significant is the subtlety with which Williams' influence permeated the narrative. Unlike sensationalized portrayals of gangster life, The Wire presents a layered, immersive exploration of systemic dynamics. The series creators emphasized realism, moral ambiguity, and structural forces, rather than relying on exaggerated violence or spectacle. Williams' life fit this framework perfectly. His approach to power was strategic rather than performative, patient rather than impulsive, and grounded in observation rather than theatrics. His story reinforced the series' exploration of how intelligence, foresight, and careful management could operate alongside, and sometimes above, the brute force often associated with crime. Williams' involvement also demonstrates his ability to adapt to a world that had changed dramatically since his rise. He had once relied on discretion, operational control, and strategic patience to navigate legal and social systems. In the world of media and storytelling, these same qualities allowed him to provide insight without overexposure. He could guide, influence, and inform the narrative while maintaining control over his personal legacy. This mirrors a broader theme in his life: influence does not require direct action or public visibility. It can be exercised subtly, strategically, and enduringly, even in realms far removed from the streets. The impact of Williams' influence extends beyond fictional characters. By shaping the portrayal of Avon Barksdale, he helped create a cultural understanding of the dynamics of urban drug trade, systemic inequities, and the psychology of power. Viewers were invited to see a complex individual operating within a broader network of constraints, incentives, and pressures. This perspective challenges simplistic notions of criminality and authority, highlighting the intelligence, strategy, and human insight required to navigate such systems. Through Barksdale, audiences could engage with the operational sophistication that Williams had mastered in real life, providing both education and nuanced entertainment. Moreover, this influence illustrates the power of narrative to reshape legacy. Williams' life had already been defined by observation, discipline, and calculated risk management. By participating indirectly in cultural storytelling, he extended that influence into a domain where it could resonate broadly, shaping perception and understanding for audiences far removed from Baltimore streets. In essence, his operational mastery translated into narrative authority. The lessons embedded in his real-world strategies, about patience, discretion, hierarchy, and foresight, were preserved and communicated through fiction, demonstrating that legacy can be crafted not just through action, but through interpretation and cultural transmission. This period also reinforced Williams' understanding of perception and influence. Just as he had carefully managed relationships, risk, and visibility during his operational years, he now engaged with media, creators, and audiences in a similarly strategic manner. He could control how aspects of his life were represented, ensure that lessons were emphasized without glorifying illegal activity, and maintain his personal integrity while shaping public understanding. Influence, in this sense, became a matter of guiding interpretation rather than issuing commands, a subtle exercise of power that required the same patience and foresight that had sustained him in the streets. Through the lens of Avon Barksdale, Williams' story achieved a dual purpose. It provided audiences with a compelling, authentic portrayal of strategic criminality, and it offered a nuanced reflection of his life philosophy. Authority is not defined by spectacle, but by foresight. Power is not imposed solely through aggression, but through structure, trust, and control. Survival is not a product of chance, but of discipline, observation, and the careful management of risk. These themes, derived directly from Williams' experiences, became central to the series' broader commentary on urban life, systemic challenges, and the interplay between individuals and institutions. Ultimately, Williams' influence on The Wire exemplifies how real-world expertise can inform cultural representation without compromising personal safety or privacy. He transformed operational knowledge into narrative insight, ensuring that audiences could appreciate the sophistication, discipline, and intelligence required to navigate high-stakes systems. In doing so, he extended the reach of his legacy beyond Baltimore streets, leaving a lasting imprint on both popular culture and the understanding of urban crime dynamics. Through Avon Barksdale, the lessons of his life, strategic thinking, calculated patience, and disciplined influence, were immortalized in a way that transcended legal, social, and geographic boundaries, demonstrating that true mastery often endures most powerfully when exercised quietly, subtly, and with enduring insight. As Melvin Williams approached the later stages of his life, reflection became an inevitable companion. For decades, his existence had been defined by observation, calculation, and adaptation. Each step, from his early understanding of Baltimore's streets to his rise as a discreet but influential figure in the underground economy, through trial, imprisonment, and eventual reinvention, had been shaped by a profound awareness of the systems around him. In this final stretch, the convergence of past experience, present reality, and cultural legacy provided a unique lens through which to understand the contours of his life. It was a time to assess not just survival, but meaning, influence, and enduring lessons. Williams' reflections likely began with the environment that had molded him. Baltimore, in all its contradictions, had been both teacher and stage. Its streets, marked by economic decline, structural neglect, and social pressure, created the conditions that demanded ingenuity and vigilance. The systems he had navigated, both legal and illicit, were extensions of the city's dynamics, and his ability to operate successfully within them required profound understanding. Observation, patience, and the subtle exercise of control had allowed him to navigate these environments with a level of efficiency and resilience that few could match. Looking back, he could see clearly how environment, circumstance, and personal discipline intersected to shape opportunity, risk, and decision-making. The trials and legal scrutiny that punctuated his life would occupy another area of reflection. The 1987 acquittal, followed by financial prosecutions, had tested both his operational acumen and his psychological resilience. Unlike mythologized portrayals of criminal invincibility, Williams' experience demonstrated that survival under scrutiny required continuous adaptation and awareness. Each encounter with law enforcement reinforced the principle that control was not about overpowering others, but about anticipating pressure, managing risk, and maintaining composure. His legal battles illustrated the limits of visibility, the power of discretion, and the subtle ways in which intelligence could outmaneuver systemic rigor without confrontation. Prison, too, offered lessons that were both practical and philosophical. Constrained environments strip away superficial freedoms, leaving only essential patterns of behavior and interaction. In this context, Williams honed his capacity for observation, patience, and psychological acuity. He understood the dynamics of hierarchy, the subtle negotiation of influence, and the consequences of misjudged actions. This period was not marked by spectacle or violence, but by the disciplined application of strategy within a system designed to limit autonomy. Reflection on these years likely reinforced a central truth: the ability to navigate constraints, whether social, institutional, or structural, defines enduring influence. Post-release life introduced a different set of reflections. The world beyond prison walls was both familiar and changed. New generations, evolving social norms, and shifting economic pressures required adaptation. Williams' choice to focus on mentorship, cultural contribution, and narrative influence demonstrated an understanding of indirect power. Influence, he learned, could be exercised through guidance, observation, and education, without the immediate need for operational dominance. This period highlighted the difference between raw control and strategic impact, showing that wisdom and foresight often outlast visibility or direct authority. The cultural dimension of his legacy, particularly his influence on The Wire, offered a unique perspective on the intersection of lived experience and societal interpretation. Through the character of Avon Barksdale and the broader narrative of the show, elements of Williams' strategies, philosophy, and approach to leadership were communicated to a wider audience. Reflection here likely included an appreciation of narrative as a vehicle for influence, how experiences could be translated into stories that shaped public understanding, emphasized lessons about systemic dynamics, and preserved the subtleties of strategy and restraint. This indirect form of influence became as enduring as any operational control he had exercised in Baltimore. Financial discipline, once a shield against legal exposure, also remained a point of contemplation. Managing resources, maintaining separation between personal and operational assets, and exercising restraint had been crucial both during active operations and in navigating post-acquittal pressures. Reflection on these practices likely reinforced the importance of foresight, consistency, and the long-term perspective. Wealth, influence, and authority were inseparable from the ability to anticipate vulnerabilities and manage risk over time, a lesson reinforced by both success and challenge. Another area of reflection likely concerned the human dimension of his life: relationships, loyalty, trust, and influence. Williams' operations depended not on force alone, but on understanding human behavior, predicting reactions, and cultivating reliability. These lessons extended beyond the criminal context into personal life, mentorship, and cultural engagement. He had learned that influence is not always about command; it can be exercised through guidance, discretion, and the cultivation of trust. Survival and impact often depend on patience and observation rather than visibility or coercion. The myth versus reality of his life would also be a natural point of contemplation. Public perception often emphasized audacity, danger, and near-mythical skill. Yet the reality was defined by discipline, careful strategy, and patient management of variables. Williams' reflection likely included an awareness of the disparity between legend and truth, the ways in which stories elevate spectacle while obscuring the subtleties of long-term planning, restraint, and psychological mastery. Understanding this gap reinforced the value of strategic thought and quiet influence over performative action. Health, aging, and mortality may have also shaped his reflections. Survival over decades in high-risk environments requires not only intelligence but physical and mental endurance. Years of navigating the streets, legal pressures, and incarceration underscore the fragility of life even amid careful planning. Reflection would likely include recognition of vulnerability, the passage of time, and the ways in which preparation, patience, and discipline can mitigate but never fully eliminate risk. This awareness, paradoxically, may enhance clarity, emphasizing the importance of each decision and each moment of strategic choice. Legacy, in its many forms, would have been central to these reflections. Operational success, legal victories, mentorship, cultural influence, all combined to create a complex and layered narrative. Williams' story illustrates that influence is not a single act but a continuum, a series of calculated choices, disciplined practices, and adaptive strategies. Reflection on legacy is an evaluation not of spectacle, but of sustained impact, of lessons preserved, and of influence exerted through both visible and invisible channels. Ultimately, this period of reflection underscores the continuity in Williams' philosophy throughout his life. Observation, discipline, patience, and strategic foresight remained constants, whether navigating Baltimore streets, federal investigations, prison hierarchies, or post-release engagement with media and mentorship. Reflection on his life demonstrates the cumulative power of consistent principles applied across changing circumstances, highlighting that true mastery resides not in a single act of brilliance, but in decades of disciplined, adaptive action. In considering his journey from the streets of Baltimore to cultural representation and personal reinvention, the narrative of Melvin Williams becomes not just a story of survival, but a study in strategic human behavior. Reflection illuminates how calculated patience, disciplined observation, and careful management of relationships and resources create influence that endures beyond immediate environments, legal systems, and public perception. His life, when examined thoughtfully, provides enduring lessons about power, adaptation, and the subtle mechanics of influence that outlast spectacle, chaos, and myth.